supervisor.
There are,
another one about
injection.
I
You should have 3 pieces of paper. One is from plan to maintenance, training a naive animal for needle behaviors, and the other 2 are shaping plans, one for blood collection, one for injection. I made 15 copies because I had no idea how many people were coming, so we can make more copies later.
I have an injection.
I have voluntary blood.
Shaking plan injection. Shaking plan injection. Injection.
Okay, so are y'all participating? Okay. Yeah, that's good. Please reinforce yourselves for sitting here, by all means. So, on my agenda, it said that we should talk about training naive animals for needle behaviors. So I took that in a very broad sense, and I'm not showing you PowerPoints, I'm not showing you videos, because I feel like we've kind of done a lot of that. So some faces are newer, some I've seen multiple times. So I didn't bring the computer. If you feel like at some point during the next hour that would enhance what we're talking about, I can always trot across the way and get the computer and look it up. I can interpretive dance across the way. Yes, absolutely. I can brachiate. No, I couldn't. I would break. So, as I was thinking about this and trying to kind of figure out what your needs might be and where the interests might lie, I just lumped all needle behaviors, which typically we think of either taking something out, blood draw, or putting something in, injection. There might be other types of putting something in, like an IV infusion or something like that, but I didn't necessarily include that. But try to think about these behaviors in a very general sense. And based on the survey information that we got back, there was some mention of more specifics, taking a behavior from start to finish. And so I guess needle behaviors sort of fell into that. And my objective is always to give you broad bits of information that you can then apply to your specific situations, rather than telling you, here's step A, B, C, D, do it exactly this way because it really works great. We all know that's BS, because every situation, every animal is a little bit different. So if you have a broad understanding and have seen, different videos, different live training with animals here or at other facilities, then you can start to process that information and apply it to your own individual situations. So that's really my objective, not to give you a recipe book, but to give you a broad understanding so you can apply it. So I hope I'm interpreting that from the survey. And if anybody ever wants to just kind of tell me something, like, hey, this is really what we'd like you to talk about, to my face, that's totally fine. You're not hurting my feelings. I want to not stand up here and waste your time and mine. So I'm trying to kind of figure out what it is that you need, but I have like a little bit of information about what that is. Maybe that's because you're not quite sure. Maybe it's because you haven't written out in detail in the survey. So anyway, that's my disclaimer, I guess, which I know is how you're never supposed to start things. But if you want to say, whoa, time out, this is not at all what we want to talk about, please do that. So anyway, the first page that you have, the plan to maintenance, in thinking about needle behaviors, I mean, obviously animals have to become comfortable with needles. Some of these behaviors are going to require, perhaps, maybe not, veterinary staff to participate. So in thinking about the different components of these behaviors, you have your shaping plan, how you plan on training the behavior from start to finish. I think in so far as taking the behavior from training to an established situation where it's at maintenance level, you have to decide what does established mean. So for something like a body part presentation, when the animal gives you their foot, over the course of 2 weeks, 8 out of 10 times, you can say, yep, that's established, check, they're doing it 80% of the time across a number of training sessions. So it gives you a pretty good sense that the animal really understands when you do this, they present their left foot. So that's really easy to kind of say, yep, established, check, now I'm going to start transferring it to other people. But with needle behaviors, I think it's a little bit different because one, it's an invasive behavior and it hurts. No matter how much training you do, the needle still hurts, right? So you have to think about that. But then if it's something like training for an annual anesthetic event, annual, happens once a year, so you don't have those within a 2-week period, multiple training sessions to say, yep, I can repeat this every time I need to, because you would be looking at the course of 5 years to even have 5 real opportunities. So thinking about how we determine that this is an established or reliable behavior with a needle behavior, I think is a little bit different. And I'll describe that in a second. So then when you think that the behavior is reliable, then the next step you might want to do is transfer it to other people. And again, depending on the behavior, if it's a blood draw, you may be working with 2 people, you may be working by yourself. So you have to decide how you're going to transfer each of those roles. And I think it was last time I was here, maybe 2 times ago, I gave you a handout on transferring behavior that just kind of has some criteria that you can work through when you're transferring to try to ensure the most consistency as you pass the behavior along. So feel free to refer to that, or if you don't have it, lost it, threw it away, because you thought you'd never have to look at it again, and if you want to look at it again, let me know, and I'll make it available. And then if you are working with 2 people, one person's probably going to be the trainer, one person's probably going to be the technician, and I think those roles are also described in some of the materials that we've handed out before, but essentially the trainer is the person who gives overall direction to the animal, provides cues, provides the food reinforcement, is bridging for overall position, and the technician is the person who's taking the blood, giving the injection, whatever it might be. And they would assume some bridging responsibility, but when only through communication with the trainer, so that everybody's not tweeting all at once. So anyway, that's what I mean by if you have 2 people, how you have to think about transferring and how you're going to go about doing that. And then establishing a maintenance schedule. So those were the sort of 4 overall components of starting with a naive animal for needle behaviors, and then taking that animal through the training process, through the determining this established behavior, transferring, and maintenance. And I don't know if you just want to take a second to kind of look over. So what I did was for each of those bullet points, those 4 points, just do a few bullet points for discussion. So if you want to take a second and just kind of read over that, see if it makes sense to you and what questions you might have. And then, like I said, the 2 other papers you have are shaping plans for examples. So I thought we could, rather than me talking at you, we could go through each of these components, each of these 4 components, and see what I've missed.
I don't think we have enough copies, so maybe we should put it up on the screen. Do we have any more copies around?
Who needs one still? I'm sorry, I had no idea how many.
There's some sets up here.
If you could have, I can share.
I only have one though, I don't have one here. Look at there's a 3rd one.
Is there a blood one? Yeah, and if somebody, you can have my originals if somebody needs copies.
Does anyone have the first one?
We have this one.
Do you want mine? Okay. Yeah, so the other two are just examples for shaping plans, and if we have time and want to look at them, we can do that. But I guess first off, thank you. Those 4 elements, does anybody have anything else they would add to that, or comments on kind of the overview part of it? And then we'll get into the details of each. So we can just kind of talk through those. Do you have, so starting with the shaping plan considerations, I mean, again, if you want to, if you haven't seen these shaping plans before, I believe that they've been handed out and made available at least to some sections. So you have a voluntary blood that's from an elephant for the ear, and then a present for injection for a primate for either a leg or an arm. But you can easily fill in bear doing a lean in, presenting the shoulder or the hip for an injection. So you can kind of plug in another animal here. But the idea is just to sort of have a look at, 1, the layout of the shaping plan, and then 2, the number of steps that might be considered for these Neelde behaviors. So does anybody have any questions on the shaping plan considerations and components? I know for a lot of the behaviors we're starting to talk about now, they are veterinary behaviors. And I know one of the first things that I've asked a number of you is, well, have you gotten with the vet staff? Do you know exactly the equipment that's needed? Do you know how long the animal has to hold? How much solution will be injected, or how much blood is needed? Are there any special handling techniques required for the blood draw, or nebulizer, or whatever it is, whatever those veterinary behaviors are? I do think it's absolutely critical that you touch base with the vet staff and get a really good idea of exactly what they need. Because you're basically facilitating vet care. So is it something that you can, if it's a rabies vaccination, sometimes veterinarians want a veterinarian, or legally need a veterinarian to administer the rabies vaccination. How much leeway is that for this, is there for this species that you're working with? So I think those are really important considerations when you're making your plan. Because you could do a great training plan and you've got the animal all trained up, and then the vet says, yep, I've got to give the injection. Hadn't even planned for that. Or now the animal has to, you're planning for an anesthetic injection, now the animal has to be isolated for 12 hours prior to the anesthesia. It doesn't matter how well you train the injection part of it if you haven't included that isolation, and perhaps NPO is one of the abbreviations I use. Nothing by mouth is basically no food, nothing in the mouth, no food, no water. Is that one of the things you were? I really like sitting here watching you read. It's a creepy oddity thing, but you're like, so it's kind of telltale, like, okay, what are the things that she's crossing her eyes about?
That's exactly what I was pointing out.
Yeah, so NPO is nothing by mouth. And, before most animals are anesthetized, they have to go without food and water for X amount of time. So those are all things that are important to include in your training process. It's not just about desensitizing to the needle, it might also be about social separation and then getting no food. Because if it's an animal with experience, they know exactly what that means. And yeah, you can put a needle in me all day long, but not when it comes to those set of circumstances that surround the real thing. Chimpanzees taught me a whole lot about that. We had to do a lot of what we always call mock NPOs, where we would isolate the animal, go through the whole thing, whether it was a blunt or an actual stick, but we would do the whole thing, because otherwise, the day that you actually needed to do the anesthesia, you isolate the animal, they don't have anything to eat or drink, they know, and they're like, screw you and your needle, right? So that part of it does become really important. So again, kind of identifying what all of those components are, and you can't be expected to do that without considerable veterinary input. Particularly for maybe newer behaviors or a different scenario that you haven't done in the past. And I guess another part of that, and I know that we've talked about this in desensitization discussions, is the needle size. So again, no amount of training takes away the pain of the needle. The needle always hurts. A bigger needle hurts more than a smaller needle. That's undeniably real. So if you have an animal that's trained to hold a position for an extended period of time, then perhaps you can get away with using a smaller needle because you're confident the animal will, or reasonably confident, the animal will hold position. So for blood draws, things like that, you know, unless there's some reason that you need gallons of blood taken from the animal, you might find that you can use a smaller gauge needle, the animal's willing to hold position longer, and you withdraw the blood a little bit more slowly, but you still get a great sample and you get enough to run whatever test you're looking at doing. And the animal's more willing to repeat the behavior because it doesn't hurt so much. A 23 gauge hurts way less than a 19 gauge needle. So that's a little bit different approach. You know, most veterinarians are working in the realm of, we gotta get it in, get out, because we know it hurts and we know the animal doesn't like it. So stab them with a big needle, get it done, get out. Which is a very different approach than, I'm gonna reinforce the animal for standing here, letting me do these things to them. If it hurts less, they're more likely to stand there for longer. So that holds true for blood draws, injections of compounds that don't burn. But when it comes to a compound that burns, you know, that could be a little bit different matter. And it may be that we know ketamine burns like a son of a gun, so we're going to use a slightly bigger needle to get it in fast and get out. Because if you expect them to hold while you gently inject the ketamine, that's probably not happening because it burns so much. So I think in part of your information gathering is what does it, if it's an injection, what does it feel like for the animal? Does it burn? And that may dictate how your shaking plan goes, what size needle you work up to, and also what the volume is, obviously. There are, and I didn't learn this until sometime into my career, but you can actually buffer some compounds, and I don't know if that's something that has been discussed with the vets, but it is possible to buffer some of the agents that you're injecting so they burn less. So that could be really helpful when you're working on a voluntary situation.
Does that increase the volume?
I don't think so. Sometimes it's a matter of adding, you know, some sort of alkali powder, but it could, yeah. Alkaline. Yeah, because you're just balancing. A lot of times, from what I understand, I am no expert, I'm no vet, but from what I understand is it's the pH that a lot of times